Deep in Germany's legendary Black Forest, where ancient trees stand guard and fought curls like a living spirit, there lived a young woodcarver named Hans Dearman. He was famous in his village for his incredible skill, but he was even more famous for something far stranger. You see, Hans's shadow didn't behave like a normal shadow. It would stretch farther than it should, sometimes moving a full half-second behind his steps. And every now and then, villagers swore they saw it turn its head, even when Hans himself stood perfectly still. Many whispered that he was born under the crooked star, a dark omen from old German folklore. Others believed the forest itself had claimed a part of him at birth. Hans never understood it. He just lived with the silent, creeping oddity that followed him everywhere. That is, until the night the forest finally spoke to him. It was a freezing autumn evening. The moon hung low and pale, casting long, silver streaks across the mossy ground as Hans walked into the woods to gather firewood. Suddenly a voice, soft as drifting smoke, whispered from the trees, "Follow your shadow." He spun around, his breath thawing in the frigid air. There was no one there. But when he looked down, his shadow had shifted forward, pointing like a stretched, black finger toward a narrow, overgrown path he had never taken before. His heart pounded in his chest, a frantic drum against his ribs. But beneath the fear, something ancient stirred inside him, a curiosity older and stronger than any terror. He had to know. So, he followed. The deeper he walked, the stranger the forest became. The wind began to hum, a low, chanting sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. The branches of the gnarled trees bent slightly as he passed, as if they were bowing to him. Finally, he reached a clearing dominated by a colossal tree. Its bark was twisted into grotesque faces, and its roots coiled over the ground like giant, sleeping serpents. And from behind this monstrous trunk, a woman stepped out. She wore a robe the color of thick fog, and her eyes were a startling, luminous silver. Her very presence chilled the air around him. She spoke slowly, her voice echoing the whisper he'd heard before. "I am the Shadow Keeper Die Schadenhüterin." Hans was frozen in place, unable to move or speak. She raised a pale, slender hand and gently touched his shadow on the ground. The moment her fingers made contact, it rippled like the surface of a dark pond. Then, for a single, impossible heartbeat, his shadow lifted, rising from the ground like a sheet of black silk before snapping back into place. Hans stumbled backward, gasping. The Shadow Keeper looked at him with her unnerving silver eyes, and said, "You are chosen, Hans Dearman. Your shadow is not your own. It is a gate, and tonight, the gate opens." Before he could ask what she meant, she dissolved into a wisp of smoke and vanished. Over the next few days, a quiet dread fell over the village. The shadows were no longer behaving. People would see them crawling along walls long after the sun had set, moving independently of their owners, whispering just at the edge of hearing. Animals refused to go outside after dusk, cowering in their barns. Children cried in their sleep, pointing to corners of their rooms where nothing stood but darkness. The world felt wrong, as if the natural order of light and dark had been broken. Then, one morning, tragedy struck. A young boy had disappeared from his bed. The only thing they found was his shadow, burned into the wooden wall of his home like a scorched handprint reaching out in terror. Panic ripped through the village. Some turned on Hans, their fear twisting into accusation. "This is your fault," they screamed. Others, desperate, begged him for help. "You know the forest," they pleaded. "You have to do something." Hans knew they were right. He knew this was connected to him, to his strange shadow, to the cryptic words of the Shadow Keeper. The time had come to face whatever was happening. He ran back into the Black Forest, his heart heavy with guilt and fear, and returned to the ancient tree. But the Shadow Keeper was not there. Instead, something far darker emerged from the swirling fog to greet him. It was a towering figure, a man-shaped mass of pure, swirling smoke. It had no face, only two points of light that burned like hot coals for eyes. Its fingers dripped a black, inky substance that sizzled as it hit the ground. Hans recognized this being from the most forgotten and terrifying of German myths. This was Der Schattenkönig, the Shadow King. His voice was not a sound but a feeling, a thunderous vibration that seemed to collapse the air around them. Hans Dearman, it boomed, you hold the longest shadow of mankind. You are the key to releasing my army. The world itself seemed to tremble. A bitter cold wrapped around Hans's throat like an invisible fist, choking him. In a choked whisper, Hans managed to ask, "What do you want from me?" The Shadow King glided closer, the shadows of the forest writhing behind him like a nest of serpents. "Your shadow is a door," the king hissed. "Through it, my realm of darkness will spill into yours and consume the light. Give it to me." Willingly, Hans turned to run, but the ground beneath his feet dissolved. It opened into a swirling vortex of black mist, a spinning maw of pure nothingness. He fell, screaming, into the abyss. He hit the ground with a bone-jarring thud. When he blinked his eyes open, he was in a world unlike anything he could have possibly imagined. It was a vast, endless plain of shifting, whispering shadows. There was no sky, no sun, no horizon. Only an eternal twilight filled with crawling, spiraling shapes that laughed with soft, cruel voices. Hans felt a violent tug at his feet. It was his own shadow, desperately trying to pull away from him, to join the legion of darkness around them. He grabbed at it, wrestling with his own darkness, trying to hold on. But it was no use. The Shadow King appeared, towering over him like a mountain of night. "You cannot control what you fear," the king growled, his voice shaking the very ground. But in that moment of despair, Hans remembered the Shadow Keeper's words, "The shadow draws strength from the heart. If you fear it, it rules you. If you face it, it obeys you." With a surge of newfound resolve, Hans forced himself to stand tall, though his knees shook uncontrollably. He stopped fighting his shadow. Instead, he looked down at it and spoke, his voice clear and steady. "I am not running from you anymore." The shadow instantly froze. Then, as if it had taken a breath, it flowed back towards him, rejoining his body like liquid night. And as it did, a surge of warm, gray light burst from Hans's chest. The light wasn't bright, but it was real, and in this realm of absolute darkness, it was everything. The Shadow King staggered back, shielding his coal-red eyes. The king let out a roar so loud the shadow ground cracked open. "You dare defy me? I am the night itself," he thundered. But Hans stepped forward, and now his own shadow began to glow with a faint, silver light, a gift from the Shadow Keeper, a remnant of her touch. He raised his hand, and the silver shadow light erupted from him like a wave, slashing through the king's smoky form. The king shrieked, a sound like dying thunder echoing across the plains. Every shadow creature in the realm trembled and recoiled. Hans shouted, his voice filled with a power he never knew he possessed, "No more stolen children. No more enslaved shadows. This ends now." With one final, desperate burst of silver radiance, he struck at the Shadow King's core. A deafening silence fell over the realm. Then, the Shadow King cracked like a pane of broken glass. His form shattered, dissolving into harmless, drifting smoke that faded into nothing. The realm shook violently one last time, and Hans felt himself being thrown upward, back toward the light. He awoke with a gasp beneath the ancient tree in the black forest. Sunlight was cutting through the morning fog, and the air was crisp and clean. The Shadow Keeper stood beside him, her silver eyes softer now, almost kind. "You did what no mortal has ever done," she said quietly. "You faced your own darkness, and you mastered it." Hans looked down. For the first time in his life, his shadow was perfectly normal. But if he looked closely, he could see a faint, silver shimmer along its edges, a quiet reminder of the power he now commanded. When Hans returned to the village, he was greeted with joyous cries. The missing boy had been found at the edge of the forest, scared and confused, but alive and unharmed. The villagers celebrated Hans as a hero, though he never told them the full, impossible truth of what had happened. They simply saw a change in him. He smiled a little differently now. He was calmer, more certain of himself. Hans went back to his life, back to carving wood. But sometimes, late at night, when the moon hung low and full in the sky, he would see his shadow shimmer with that soft, silver light. It was no longer a curse, no longer something to be feared. It was his guardian. And he knew, deep in his heart, that the greatest shadow you will ever have to face is the one you carry inside yourself. But if you have the courage to confront it, it will become your greatest strength instead of your deepest fear.